My sister called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me that my husband of 9 years had been seen moving boxes into her apartment. Not her words exactly. What she actually said was, "I think you need to come home, Margot. There's something you should see." But I knew, the way you know sometimes before the words arrive, the way your body understands what your mind is still negotiating. I was in the parking lot of the Kroger on Beachmont Avenue in Cincinnati when she called, and I sat in that car for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive. My name is Margot Ellison. I was 43 years old, a senior contracts manager at a medical device company, and for 9 years I had been married to a man named Ryan Ellison. We lived in a gray craftsman house in Hyde Park with a front porch we'd always meant to furnish and a kitchen we'd renovated the summer before last. We had a cat named Fig, a savings account we'd built slowly and carefully, and a marriage that had gone from something warm to something functional without either of us naming the moment it happened. My sister was Cassie Thorne. She lived 12 minutes away in Oakley, in an apartment she'd rented since her own divorce 3 years earlier. We talked on the phone 4 or 5 times a week. She knew my grocery list, my work frustrations, which of my colleagues I trusted and which I didn't. She was, I had believed without question, the person I could call in any emergency. She was also, it turned out, the emergency. I don't want to linger on the moment I saw the truth of it, because that moment doesn't need more space than it already took. What I will say is this. When I walked into my own house that evening, and Ryan was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me, already composed, already resolved, I understood from the careful way he folded his hands that the conversation had been rehearsed. People who are genuinely sorry don't rehearse. People who have been planning something rehearse. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "I already know," I said. He flinched. That was the only moment where his composure broke. He'd been ready for grief, for anger, for disbelief. He hadn't been ready for calm. "Cassie and I," he started. "Don't," I said. I walked upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed, and looked at my hands for a long time. Then I looked at my phone. I had 3 unread texts from Cassie, all sent within the last 2 hours. I didn't read them. I set the phone face down and went to the window and watched a neighbor walk her dog in the fading November light, the dog stopping every few feet to investigate something, the woman patient and unhurried, the whole scene indifferent to the fact that my life had just changed shape entirely. Ryan left that night. 2 bags. He'd done the same calculation Derek did, the one that's really about how long you've been planning, not how quickly you decide. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and I went downstairs and made tea I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with Fig circling my feet, and I thought about how 9 years can become a suitcase so fast. I gave myself 2 days to fall apart, not dramatically, quietly, the way I do most things. Then on the 3rd day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Area code 503, Portland, Oregon. "May I speak with Margot Ellison?" The voice was formal, measured. "This is Lawrence Bauer. I'm a probate attorney. I'm calling regarding the estate of Gerald Fitzwilliam." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "I'm sorry," I said. "Who?" "Gerald Fitzwilliam. He passed away last month. You were named in his will as the primary beneficiary, Gerald Fitzwilliam." I hadn't said that name aloud in over 12 years. Gerald had been my supervisor at the first real job I'd ever had, a boutique engineering consultancy in Portland, where I worked for 4 years in my late 20s before moving back to Ohio. He was 62 when I met him, a widower, meticulous and fair, the kind of man who sent handwritten notes when someone did good work and remembered the names of everyone's children. We'd stayed in occasional contact after I left. A card at Christmas, an email when he heard I got married. The last message I'd received from him was 3 years ago when he wrote to say he'd been reading about a project my company had completed and was proud of how far I'd come. I'd written back. We'd exchanged 2 more emails. Then, as these things go, the thread had gone quiet. The estate is valued at approximately $6.4 million, Lawrence Bauer said. However, Mr. Fitzwilliam attached a condition to the bequest. You must appear in person at our office in Portland within 30 days of this notification, and you must provide documentation confirming that you are not currently in an active legal marriage. The kitchen was very quiet. Are you still there? He asked. I'm here, I said. What happens if the condition isn't met? The estate is distributed to a list of STEM education nonprofits Mr. Fitzwilliam designated. There's no appeal mechanism, no contest window applicable to a beneficiary in your position. The condition is simply either satisfied or it isn't. I understand, I said. Do you need time to consider? I'll be there, I said. I'll be in touch to confirm the date. I hung up and sat there for a long time. Fig jumped onto the table and walked across my arms, and I let him, just sat there with a cat on my forearms and the late morning light cutting across the kitchen floor, and the slow understanding settling over me that the world occasionally does a strange and particular thing where it hands you a door at exactly the moment you've run out of options. The problem was the math. Ryan and I, so we're still legally married. Divorce in Ohio, even uncontested, takes time. The standard timeline for an uncontested divorce, where both parties agree, is 60 to 90 days. Contested can take a year or more. I had 30 days. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and went through what remained. The house was jointly owned. Our shared checking account had $24,000 in it. When I logged into the account that afternoon, I saw that Ryan had transferred $48,000 from our joint savings 2 weeks before he'd left. 2 weeks, which meant he'd had the account information, the routing numbers, and the intention, all 3, while we were still eating dinner together and talking about whether to redo the front porch before spring. I looked at that number, $48,000, for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called a divorce attorney named Sandra Pratt. I'd found her name through a colleague who'd used her 3 years ago and described her as the kind of lawyer who wins by being 2 steps ahead. I needed exactly that. I did not tell Sandra about the inheritance, not because I was hiding it from her. She would need to know eventually. But I understood something from the 9 years I'd spent reading contracts. You don't reveal your strongest card before the table is set. I needed to understand what we were working with legally before I explained what was at stake. I asked Sandra about the fastest possible path to a finalized divorce in Ohio. I asked about expedited hearings, about separation agreements, about what could accelerate a timeline without destroying it. Sandra listened without interrupting. She had the particular quality of good attorneys where her silence felt like work. You can file today, she said. If Ryan signs a SABR agreement, we seek a waiver on the standard waiting period. Potentially finalize in 45 to 60 days with a cooperative respondent. If he contests anything, she paused. Is that a concern? He withdrew $48,000 from our joint savings before he left, I said. Her pen stopped moving. I could hear it. Then we file this afternoon, she said, and we document everything from the beginning. I walked out of Sandra's office into a gray November afternoon, feeling something I hadn't felt in days. Not hope exactly. More like traction, the sensation of a wheel catching on solid ground after spinning. What I hadn't told Sandra was the part that changed the calculation entirely. If Ryan found out about Gerald's estate, he would do one of two things. He would drag out the divorce to try to claim a marital share of any asset received during the marriage. Or he would suddenly become cooperative in ways designed to position himself advantageously. Either way, he would turn the inheritance into leverage. So he couldn't know. Not yet. I called Lawrence Bauer's office the next morning. I spoke to his paralegal, a careful woman named Janet, who confirmed that probate notifications in Oregon are private, that no inquiry had been made to their office from any external party, and that Gerald's estate had no public record disclosure requirement at this stage. I thanked her and hung up and felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Then I called my friend Winifred Okoffer. Winifred was a tax attorney in Columbus and the most practically intelligent person I'd known since graduate school. I didn't tell her about the estate either, but I asked her, in general terms, about how an inheritance from a premarital professional relationship would be classified in Ohio's equitable distribution framework. Generally speaking, Winifred said, after a pause that told me she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. An inheritance is separate property in Ohio, not subject to division. The key factors are the source and the timing. Did the asset exist, or was it owed to you before the marriage ended? The person who left it has been gone for a month, I said to Ed. Then the inheritance predates any divorce filing, she said. And if the relationship was premarital, entirely premarital, I said, you're on solid ground, she said. But get the documentation clear. When he died, when the will was executed, when you were notified, everything with dates. I thanked her and hung up, and added her name to the short list of people I was building carefully around myself. Sandra for the legal process, Winifred for the financial structure, and nobody else, not yet. Sandra filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday. Ryan was served 4 days later at Cassie's apartment. A detail the process server noted in the report with the blank professionalism of someone who has delivered difficult news. So many times it has become a technical function. I read that line twice. He was already there. He'd been there long enough to receive mail. I set the report down and picked it up again and set it down again, and then went for a very long walk through my neighborhood with Fig's leash empty in my hand, because Fig is an indoor cat and walks alone, which I thought was maybe the most honest thing about that particular afternoon. Ryan called me that evening. I watched his name on the screen through 4 rings and let it go to voicemail. His message was careful and measured, 4 minutes long, and used the word fair 7 times. Men who have taken $48,000 and used the word fair are giving you a complete map of who they are. I saved the voicemail as evidence and did not call back. What I did instead was begin to gather. Sandra had asked for documentation of all joint assets, all transactions, all communication establishing timeline. I spent 3 evenings scanning bank statements, pulling credit card records, organizing everything into a shared folder. On the second evening, I found what I hadn't expected to find. Ryan had been using our shared laptop to access a secondary email account. He hadn't cleared the browsing history. There were messages going back 8 months. 8 months between him and Cassie. Not passionate or reckless. Worse than that, they were planners. Discussions of timelines, of how to handle the house, of what Cassie described in one message as the cleanest exit. There was a message from Cassie that read, "She'll be okay. She always figures it out. This is actually better for her in the long run." I printed that one out and put it in a separate folder. I was not going to use it as grief. I was going to use it as evidence, Sandra, when I finally showed her everything, went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Dissipation of marital assets with documented premeditation. We can recover that $48,000 as part of the settlement, probably with interest." The emails helped. The timeline helped. The paper trail Ryan had thought was invisible helped most of all. I flew to Portland on a Thursday. Lawrence Bauer's office was on the 16th floor of a building in the Pearl District, with long windows that looked out over the Willamette River. Lawrence himself was a tall man in his 70s, with the kind of patience that comes from having spent decades inside other people's most complicated moments. He walked me through Gerald's will with a careful attention to detail that I appreciated. "Gerald spoke of you occasionally," he said with some hesitation. "We weren't in regular contact," I said. "Not for the last few years." "No," Lawrence said, "but he followed your work. He told me once that you'd been the best hire he'd made in 20 years, that you had a way of seeing the architecture of a problem that he'd never quite been able to teach anyone else." He paused. He was a private man. He didn't make gestures often. This was a significant one. I looked out at the river, gray-green in the November light, moving steadily in the direction of something it couldn't see. Gerald had executed this will 4 years ago, Lawrence told me, when I was still married to Ryan, and when there had been, as far as anyone knew, no indication of any marital difficulty. He hadn't made this bequest in response to my situation. He had simply, quietly, always intended this. It was an act of generosity so clean it had no agenda. And sitting there in that office with the river outside and Lawrence's careful voice explaining the mechanics of what Gerald had left behind, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Gratitude so large it had no particular shape, and underneath it a grief for a man I'd admired and not made enough time for. I signed the initial documentation. I now had 23 days. On the flight home, my phone produced a text from Cassie's. "I've been trying to reach you. Can we please talk? I know you're hurt, but I want you to understand what happened." I put my phone in my bag and watched Ohio appear below the clouds and thought about the difference between wanting to understand something and needing to survive it. I had already chosen. The next 2 weeks were the most precisely managed of my life. Sandra moved quickly. She'd already filed the asset dissipation claim, and Ryan's attorney, a man named Arthur Klein who practiced family law out of a Kenwood office and specialized in what Sandra called exit strategy divorces, had sent back a settlement conference request within a week. The conference was scheduled for day 9. Ryan had been cooperative at first, too cooperative, which told me Arthur Klein had advised him that contesting the divorce would be more expensive than settling. But on day 7, everything shifted. Arthur Klein sent Sandra a letter requesting a full accounting of any recently received or anticipated inheritance interests. The language was specific enough that Sandra called me immediately. "They're fishing," she said. "For what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Any asset you might be sitting on." It's a standard tactic in situations where one spouse appears to have undisclosed resources. Doesn't mean they know anything. Can they find anything? I asked. Oregon probate filings at this stage are not in any public database they'd have access to, Sandra said. But I want you to tell me everything about the inheritance right now, Margot. All of it. If they find something before I do, I can't protect you. So I told her. All of it. Gerald, the estate, the condition, the timeline, the $6.4 million. There was a long silence. "How many days do we have left?" she said. 21. Another silence. Then, "Okay, here's what we're doing." The settlement conference was on a Thursday morning in Sandra's conference room. Ryan arrived with Arthur Klein, and the version of Ryan who sat down across from me was not the one I'd been married to. He was careful, groomed, angled forward in the way of a man who believes he is about to negotiate something significant. He kept his eyes on the table and only looked at me directly once at the beginning, and I returned the look without any particular expression and watched him look away first. Arthur Klein laid out their position. Ryan was entitled to an equitable share of all assets acquired during the marriage. He wanted the house equity split 60-40 in his favor, given his claim that he'd contributed more to the mortgage in the early years. He wanted $20,000 from the savings account beyond what was already there. He wanted a formal accounting of any assets received within 12 months of the divorce filing. Sandra said, "Before we discuss the house, let's discuss the $48,000. The room changed temperature. Sandra laid out the documentation, the bank transfer records, the email timestamps, the 8 months of correspondence with Cassie Thorne that demonstrated clearly and legally premeditated dissipation of marital assets in anticipation of divorce. Arthur Klein reviewed the documents with a face that revealed nothing. Then he conferred with Ryan in a low voice for 90 seconds. My client is prepared to return $30,000 and agree to an equal split of the house equity," Arthur Klein said. "We'll take the $30,000 equal house split, and we want the divorce finalized and filed within 7 days," Sandra said. "Not 60. 7. Given the documented premeditation of asset dissipation, your client has limited standing to request an extended timeline." Another conference. This one lasted 4 minutes. Ryan signed the separation agreement that afternoon. I don't know exactly what Arthur Klein said to him. I suspect it involved the word exposure. I sat in the parking lot of Sandra's building for 15 minutes before I could drive. Not from grief, from something that felt like the release of pressure I'd been holding in my chest for 3 weeks. I called Winifred and said, "We're on," she said. "I'll have the asset structure framework ready by Friday." I called my mother, who lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and who had known something was wrong for 2 weeks without knowing what. I told her the outline. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I never liked Ryan's handshake." I laughed for the first time since October. Then, 4 days before the court hearing that would finalize everything, my phone showed me a text from Cassie. "I heard you went to Portland. Arthur told Ryan there might be money from an estate. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I think you owe it to us to be fair. Ryan wouldn't be in this situation if things had been different between you two. I'm just asking you to think about that. I read that text 3 times. I owe it to us to be fair." There it was. 8 months of planning, a $48,000 wire transfer, 9 years erased with 2 packed bags, and now a request for fairness addressed to me. I forwarded the text to Sandra with a 1-word message, "Received." Then I blocked Cassie's number. Sandra's response came 12 minutes later. "Perfect. Let them come." 2 days before the court date, Ryan appeared at my door. Alone this time, without Arthur Klein. I saw his car in the driveway from the upstairs window and felt something very still and very clear move through me. I went downstairs, turned on the voice memo app on my phone, and opened the door. I did not invite him in. I stood in the frame. "I just want to talk," he said. His voice was the one I'd heard in every difficult conversation of our marriage. Careful, calibrated, designed to make resistance seem like unreasonableness. "You have a minute," I said. He told me he thought we'd been hasty, that the separation agreement had been signed under pressure, that he wanted to discuss a modification, specifically around any inheritance I'd received or was about to receive, Because in Ohio, he said, equitable distribution. Ohio treats inheritance as separate property, I said. Your attorney knows this. We were married when you were notified, he said. Gerald Fitzwilliam died while we were still married. That creates a nexus that your attorney already tried to build an argument around, I said. And didn't. The agreement is filed and the hearing is in 2 days. Is there anything else? His composure slipped just at the edges. You're really going to do this? You took $48,000 and moved into my sister's apartment, I said. I didn't do anything, I responded. I made a mistake, he said. It came out flat, the sound of a man who has rehearsed an apology without feeling it. I know, I said. Margot, Ryan, I said. If you contact me again outside of formal legal channels, I'll add it to the harassment documentation Sandra has been building since November. Drive safe. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my back to the door and listened to Fig chirp at me from the top of the stairs, which is what he does when he wants attention and finds the timing inconvenient. I went up and sat on the floor and let him walk on me for a while and breathed. I sent the recording to Sandra. She responded, "Good. See you Thursday." The courthouse in downtown Cincinnati on a Thursday in November smells like industrial cleaner and old radiators. I arrived at 8:45 in a charcoal blazer with a folder of documents and Sandra walking beside me, and Ryan and Arthur Klein were already in the corridor. Ryan looked at me and I looked at him, and then I looked at Sandra, and we walked to the courtroom without stopping. Arthur Klein made one final attempt outside the courtroom doors. He argued that the inheritance constituted a marital asset because Gerald had died prior to the filing of the divorce. Sandra responded with the precedents. An inheritance from a premarital relationship in a state that recognizes separate property doctrine, received post-separation, is not subject to equitable distribution under Ohio Revised Code, regardless of the date of the decedent's death. Gerald's will had been executed 4 years prior. The bequest predated any marital difficulty. There was no nexus. The judge reviewed the agreement, heard Arthur Klein's objection, and overruled it in 11 minutes. My marriage to Ryan Ellison ended at 10:07 in the morning on a Thursday in November. I walked out into the corridor. Ryan was standing near the elevator with Arthur Klein. He looked at me with something that might have been regret, or might have been recalculation. At that point, I genuinely couldn't tell and didn't need to. He started to say something, and Arthur Klein put a hand on his arm and said something quietly, and Ryan stopped. I pressed the elevator button and waited. Sandra stood beside me and said nothing, which was the exact right thing. The doors opened and I stepped in, and the last thing I saw before they closed was Ryan's face under the fluorescent lights of that corridor, arranged into an expression I didn't recognize, trying to figure out at what point exactly it had all gone wrong, as if there had been a single point, as if it had been anything other than gradual, deliberate, and entirely his own doing. The doors closed. Arthur Klein filed a challenge to the inheritance classification 9 days later. It was, Sandra said, the legal equivalent of a long shot. But they were going to make me spend money defending it and hope that would be persuasion enough. It wasn't. The challenge rested on 2 arguments: that Gerald's death occurring before the divorce filing created a marital claim on the estate, and that there was some basis for arguing the bequest was influenced by knowledge of my marital situation, making it quasi-marital in nature. The first argument collapsed under the precedents Sandra had already compiled. The second required proving that Gerald had known about my marriage troubles and acted on that knowledge, which was impossible to establish, since Gerald had executed the will 4 years earlier, before there were any troubles to know about. And Lawrence Bauer confirmed in writing that Gerald had never communicated any awareness of my marital status or circumstances to him or his office. Arthur Klein withdrew the challenge 6 weeks later. Sandra's email to me that morning contained one line, "It's finished." I was sitting at my desk at work when I read it. I set my phone down and looked at the window for a moment. Then I called Lawrence Bauer and said, "We can proceed." He said he'd have the transfer documentation ready within the week. I thanked him and hung up and sat very quietly for about 30 seconds, the way you sit when something large and necessary has finally resolved. The Portland property sold in February. The brokerage accounts transferred through March. The total received after Oregon and federal tax obligations was $4,710,000. I met with a financial advisor named Renee Colcown, who specialized in sudden wealth transitions, and we built a plan that was careful and specific and completely undramatic. A house purchase outright in the Mariemont neighborhood I'd always liked, a portion in diversified index funds, a liquid reserve, and a donation to a STEM education nonprofit in Portland that Gerald had supported because that felt like the right thing, the honest thing. Sandra sent flowers. Winifred sent a bottle of champagne and a spreadsheet, which was exactly the most Winifred gesture possible. The Hyde Park house, Ryan's and mine, sold in April. Under the terms of the agreement, we split the equity. Ryan received $94,000. I received the same. I put mine into the liquid fund and didn't think about it again. I moved in May. The new house had a back garden with an old oak tree and a porch I actually furnished immediately before I'd unpacked most of the boxes, because I had learned that there is no wisdom in saving things for later when later is already here. Ryan made one more attempt to contact me, not through his attorney, a text message in March that said, "I know things got complicated. I want you to know I don't blame you for how this went." I showed it to Winifred at our next lunch, and she said flatly, "He doesn't blame you." Remarkable. I blocked his number and we ordered more coffee. Cassie sent a letter, handwritten on stationery she'd had since college, the kind with tiny blue flowers at the top. She wrote that she missed me, that she thought about calling every day, that she hoped I knew how sorry she was about the way things had happened. There was no return address, as though she'd already anticipated silence. I held the letter for a moment, and then I put it in the recycling bin, because there are some distances that are the correct distance, and this was one of them. I didn't hate either of them. That surprised me more than almost anything about this whole year. I'd moved through shock and anger and the cold, focused purposefulness of those November weeks, and what I'd found on the other side was something I can only describe as a vast and impersonal clarity. They were people who had made choices. I was a person who had made choices. Our choices had taken us to entirely different places, and the place I had arrived at was, by every measure that mattered, better than where I'd started. What helped? Winifred, who met me for lunch every other week and talked more about life than law, who I discovered, over an otherwise ordinary Tuesday salad, had grown up in the same part of Columbus where I'd gone to college and had somehow never mentioned this in 12 years of friendship. My neighbor in Mariemont, a retired English teacher named Bet Hollowell, who left vegetables from her garden on my porch with handwritten notes that were funny and warm and asked nothing in return. My therapist, Dr. Angela Marsh, who I started seeing in January, and who on our third session said something I've thought about many times since. You're not afraid of being alone. You're afraid of having been fooled. Those are different problems with different solutions. She was right. I learned to tell the difference. By the 2nd November, I had a house I loved, work that interested me, a cat who remained entirely indifferent to everything I'd been through, and a life that felt like mine in a way that the previous 9 years honestly hadn't. Not because of the money, though the money changed what was possible, but because I had spent months being tested on what I was actually made of, and I had found out. The information was worth something. I went back to Portland that following October. Not for any practical reason. Gerald's estate had been fully settled for months. I went because it seemed like something owed, some acknowledgement of an act of generosity so quiet it had arrived from a man who had been gone before I even knew to be grateful. I walked through the Pearl District in the October rain. I had coffee at a small place on a corner where the windows fogged from the inside and the espresso was extremely serious. I walked along the river, which was wide and gray and moving steadily, and I thought about Gerald Fitzwilliam, about the 4 years I'd worked for him in my late 20s, about the handwritten notes he'd sent when you did something well, about the way he'd said, once, in a staff meeting, when I'd caught an error in a contract that had almost gone out. That's the thing about Margot. She reads what's actually there. I hadn't understood that as a particular compliment at the time. I understood it better now. I stood by the river for a while. 2 kayakers passed, bright orange in the gray water. A man walked by with an umbrella he wasn't really using. The city went about its business, unhurried, alive. "Thank you," I said, not to anyone present, just to the river and the rain, and the version of a man who had quietly, without drama, wished me well from a great distance and for a long time. I had a good dinner that night at a restaurant near the water. I ordered something new, drank 1 glass of Willamette Valley Pinot, and watched the light on the river change from gray to amber to dark. The waiter brought my check without being asked, which is one of the small courtesies that makes a city feel like a place worth visiting. I flew home the next morning, feeling something I'd been working toward for a year without quite knowing it. A sense of completed weight, like something that had needed to be done had been done and could now be set down. As for Ryan and Cassie, I knew only the outlines. Winifred heard things through mutual acquaintances and reported them to me with the dry, factual tone she used for everything, as though she were delivering quarterly earnings. They had been in Cassie's apartment together through the winter and into spring. But Cassie's apartment had turned out to be the kind of place that accommodates 1 person well and 2 people poorly. Ryan had strong opinions about cleanliness, and Cassie had strong opinions about everything else. And neither of these qualities had been softened by the stress of living together in a 1-bedroom in Oakley, while a divorce played out in the courts. There had been an argument in April that Winifred's contact described as prolonged and audible from the parking lot. By June, Ryan had moved into a studio in Norwood. Cassie, as far as anyone knew, was still in her apartment, working through credit card debt she apparently hadn't fully disclosed to Ryan before he moved in, managing it with difficulty, and without much contact from the man she'd decided was worth burning everything for. The grand love, the inevitable truth, the thing they'd each decided was worth 8 months of deception, and the destruction of a 9-year marriage. It had turned out to be an argument about dishes and a studio apartment in Norwood. I want to be exact about how I feel when I think about this, because I've had enough therapy now to know that the easy answer isn't always the true one. I didn't feel glad. Exactly. I felt the particular quiet understanding of someone watching a predicted thing arrive on schedule. They had built something on a foundation of convenience and wanting, and the flattering self-delusion that what they felt was singular and irresistible. And foundations like that hold until they don't. What Cassie had said to Ryan in one of those emails, "She always figures it out," had been intended, I think, as a way of relieving their guilt. She'll be fine. She doesn't need this. We're not really hurting anyone. But it had also been, without her intending it, entirely true. I had figured it out, not despite what they'd done, but in the aftermath of it, in the specific shape of the difficulty they'd created. I had found out exactly what I was capable of when there was nothing left to lose. My mother drove up from Lexington in June and stayed for a long weekend. We cooked elaborate things and watched bad movies and sat on my furnished porch in the long summer evenings. And on the last morning, over coffee, she said, "You seem different." I asked her how. She thought about it for a while. "Settled," she said. "Like you know where you are." She was right. That October, a full year after the parking lot of the Kroger on Beachmont Avenue, I was sitting on my back porch in Mariemont watching Fig conduct his extremely serious investigation of a gap in the fence boards, and I thought, this is mine. Not the house or the money or any particular object. The days, the actual texture of them, morning to evening, the feeling of waking up, and knowing that what came next was something I had chosen, something I had built, something that held, because I had tested what it was built on before I put my weight on it. I had paid for it in a way I would never have chosen to pay. But I had paid and I was here, and the October light was long and gold and entirely, exactly mine. If this story taught me anything, it's that the people who betray you are not the ones who determine what comes next. You are. And sometimes what you're capable of only becomes clear when someone else decides to show you what you're standing on. Keep your own counsel. Stay quiet about what matters. And never mistake a person's composure for the absence of a plan. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this story reached you, subscribe to Stories of Clara for more. Thank you for staying until the end.